Have you ever just looked at a map and wondered about the stories hiding behind the names of places? Well, today we're jumping right into a fascinating historical detective story, one that's hidden in the place names all across Italy. It's a mystery about a whole bunch of lakes that just appeared out of nowhere and then, just as quickly, vanished. So let's go back to the early Middle Ages. You've got scribes, right? They're documenting land grants for the Lombard kings, and all of a sudden, they start mentioning lakes everywhere. I mean, in these official records, they're called diplomas. Dozens and dozens of places named lacus, which is Latin for lake, are recorded for the very first time. But this is where it gets really weird. When you go looking for these lakes today, or even in records from just a few centuries later, they're gone. And I don't just mean dried up, they completely vanished, as if they were never even there to begin with. This leaves us with a pretty big question. How could dozens of lakes, all supposedly significant bodies of water, just appear and then disappear across Italy, leaving absolutely no geological trace behind? I mean, really, where did all that water go? So, how do we start to unravel a puzzle like this? Well, for centuries, the most common explanation was actually the simplest one you could think of. For a long time, the accepted theory was pretty straightforward. These were just normal lakes, probably sitting in marshy, wet areas. And over time, maybe the climate changed or people drained the land, and they just dried up and were forgotten. It seems to make sense, right? A single lake drying up? Sure. But dozens of them, all around the same time? That's a little harder to swallow. And that's exactly where the problem is. When you start to dig into the details, this nice, simple explanation doesn't just get a little leaky, it completely falls apart. So, the whole dried up lake idea really hinges on it being a super wet period, perfect for new lakes to form. But here's the kicker. The climate data tells us the exact opposite was happening. The Lombards actually arrived in Italy during what historians now call the late antique Little Ice Age. It was a time of significant cooling and, this is the crucial part, a drastic reduction in rainfall. There was even a writer back in the 6th century, Cassiodorus, who complained that the rain no longer wants to fall from the sky. So, yeah, this was pretty much the worst possible time for a boom in new lakes. Okay, so if the climate theory is a bust, maybe the answer isn't in the ground, but in the documents themselves. Let's take a closer look at that paper trail. A massive study from the 19th century cataloged 30 places named Lago, or something like it, in just one region of Italy. And get this, they found that at least 5 of these so-called lakes were clearly identified in the records as being actual settlements, castles or villages. Another 22 had absolutely no connection to any known body of water, past or present. And maybe the most telling clue of all, the specific names attached to them, like Lacus Aldrade or Lacus Gandolfi, weren't Latin. They were Germanic personal names, Lombard names. So we have these places called lake that had no water and were associated with Lombard names. This tells us the entire mystery might just hinge on a single, totally misunderstood word. And here we have it. The whole confusion comes down to what's basically a linguistic mistake. While in Latin, the language of the people writing this stuff down, lacus meant lake. In the Lombard language, their Germanic word lager meant something completely different, a camp, a military post, or a fortified settlement. The smoking gun, if you will, comes from an 8th century Lombard document. Buried deep in a description of property boundaries, there's this really strange, almost clunky phrase. It seems like the scribe was worried people might get confused, so he clarified that the term lacoras in this context had the same meaning as arculas, which is the Latin word for little fortresses. He was basically putting a translator's note right into the text. And just like that, the mystery is solved. The lost lakes of the Lombards were never lakes at all. They were a network of military camps and settlements set up by the Germanic conquerors. And their word for camp, lagar, just happened to sound exactly like the Latin word for lake. But that raises a whole new question, doesn't it? How does a military camp get mistaken for a phantom lake on a map for over 1,000 years? It's a fascinating look at how history can hide right out in the open. It all happened in stages. First, the Lombards named their camps lagar. Then, over a few generations, the Lombard language just died out, and the original meaning was totally forgotten. But the place name, that sound lago, stuck around. The locals, who were now speaking a language based on Latin, heard lago and naturally connected it to the only word they knew that sounded like it, lake. So, to explain why their town was called Lake when there was no water around, they invented stories, legends of a huge lake that dried up or some mythical city that drowned. A historical fact got replaced by a folk tale. And this just illustrates the whole idea brilliantly. This historical coat of arms has the motto, Immersus Immergo, which means submerged I emerge. It is the perfect metaphor for this story. The true Lombard history was submerged for centuries under a simple linguistic mix-up, but now, with a little historical detective work, its real meaning can finally emerge again. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? The names on our maps aren't just labels, they're like little artifacts, fossils of language and history. So the next time you see a strange place name, maybe don't just ask what it means now, but what it might have meant 1,000 years ago. What forgotten histories are hidden right where you live?